So today I am going to be ranking every US president off of their aura. We all know what aura is, bruh. It's like someone's energy around them, like the way they swag, kind of like stuff like that. Everyone knows what aura is. It might be outdated by now, the slang could be outdated, but I don't care. And I just wanted to start this video by saying it is about politics, but it is not a political video. I don't care who you voted for in any election ever, and I don't think someone's merit of character should be judged wholly on their political beliefs unless they're like really bad. Overall, I think extremists on both sides just ruin it for all the level-headed people in the middle. But yeah, let's get into it. And at the very bottom of the list is William Henry Harrison. Now, this guy had no chance of getting any aura because he was only president for a month before dying of pneumonia. Now, that is a terrible performance and he deserves no higher spot. Immediately after William came John Tyler. He was the first vice president to gain the presidency, and due to that, most of his critics called him Your Accidency, which is really funny for the time. Top tier shit talking. Other than that, one of his only major political actions was annexating Texas into the United States. It raised tensions before the Mexican-American War. Other than that, he vetoed so many policies proposed by his own party that he was eventually kicked out, the only president to not have a party since George Washington. After Lincoln's unfortunate assassination, Andrew Johnson stepped into office. Many of Johnson's policies acted directly against what Abraham Lincoln stood for, including an attempt to veto the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which guaranteed the same rights and protections as a white man to a freed man. He also publicly campaigned against the 14th Amendment, which finally recognized black people as American citizens. Luckily, despite these vetoes and his campaigning, both of these bills were passed. Already trying to limit the civil rights for black Americans immediately after the Civil War, going against everything Abraham Lincoln stood for, is just a snake move, if I'm being honest. He's backstabbing the president. This is why he's so low. I'm gonna butcher this pronunciation, but Rutherford B. Hayes was only able to gain the presidency because he agreed to withdraw federal troops from southern states. Those circumstances make his presidency fraudulent at best. Withdrawing troops from the South meant that many local segregation laws were passed in certain states. He did a decent job getting the country to reunite, but it came at the cost of black Americans in the South. He was a pretty stern guy. He graduated with a degree in law from Harvard, and he didn't allow any type of alcohol at White House events. Other than that, just a cranky old white dude, which to be fair, 99% of these guys are just that. Benjamin Harrison is most famous for his signing of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned monopolies, cartels, and all sorts of big company things. Benjamin Harrison oversaw the admission of 6 new states, more than any other presidency. This act, along with expanding the federal money supply and introducing tariffs, were meant to produce economic growth. However, instead, it led to a downpour. But yeah, other than that, he rarely showed any emotion in public, which is like kind of bold, kind of nonchalant. But yeah, it doesn't do well for you in the history books because no one can like really remember anything about him. Wasn't that notable. Next, James Buchanan inherited the nation at its boiling point. Right before the Civil War, you would think the president would use his power to try and reunite the country. However, instead, nearly everything James Buchanan did in office directly contradicted that and seemed to separate the country at its seams. Only 2 days into office, the Supreme Court would make one of the most infamous rulings in American history. This, of course, was the Dred Scott decision. Now, to give you a little bit of background, Dred Scott was born into slavery, and after being sold to a bunch of different owners, he ended up working for a military surgeon. Now, this surgeon would hop around to different forts and military outposts all around the country, eventually ending up in Fort Armstrong in the free state of Illinois. During Dred Scott's time there, he fell in love, got married, and had kids all in the free state of Illinois. However, when the army surgeon moved back to Missouri and Dred Scott was forced to accompany him, he tried to buy his freedom. When he was denied, he sued, arguing that he had been married, had kids, and lived on free soil, that he was now a free man. In a 7-2 ruling, the Supreme Court rejected his claim, declaring that black people are not American citizens and that living on free soil and breathing free air for a considerable amount of time does not make someone free. And it further repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. which banned slavery north of the 3630 line. James Buchanan's role in all this, he pressured the Supreme Court to make a broad ruling and publicly supported the decision. After Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 and southern states began to secede, he stated that the federal government had no power to stop it. Throughout his life, he hated abolitionists, and in his final address to Congress, he blamed the North for interfering in slavery. The guy was just kind of a dickhead, and other than that, he looks like the villain from Rio. Calvin Coolidge is known for being a man of very few words. The Silent Cal, they called him. Wow, how cool. Despite this nickname, he presided over the United States during the economic boom of the 1920s. He was the first president to speak over the radio. He reduced the size and funding of the government, which allowed for tax cuts to the American citizen. Despite his shy nature, Calvin Coolidge is actually admired by the American people. And he has a porn star name. Franklin Pierce endorsed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which again further repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and it led to Bleeding Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act enabled people within those states to vote for whether they wanted to join the United States as a free state or a slave state. So many pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers would fight each other. During the time period of Bleeding Kansas, there are approximately 65 deaths attributed to it, but back then it could have been a whole lot more. It could have been a decent bit less. And this period of violence only really ended with the outbreak of the Civil War. Pierce's failure to hold the Union together and many of his pro-slavery policies really hurt his legacy. And also one time he apparently made a secret inquisition to Spain, trying to get the territory of Cuba, implying that the US would take it by force if necessary. Pierce was described as a very heavy drinker, especially during his time in office. But I'm not going to hold the alcoholism against the man because his 11-year-old died just a tiny bit before he went into office, so that can hurt. And sometimes you need a drink to think, but he was pro-slavery, so he's going to be towards the bottom of the Aura list. To fill more of the time of Taylor's presidency, Millard stepped in and proceeded to fumble the rising tensions between the North and the South. If you notice so far, a lot of these presidents at the bottom of the list have come from the same sort of pre-Civil War time period. That's because all of them, one after another, kind of fumbled the situation and failed to hold the Union together. The way Millard in particular fumbled was the Compromise of 1850. It was passed to appease both sides. Instead, it upset everyone and made the country a whole lot angrier. The most controversial part of this compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that any slave who had run away from their owner would have to be returned to the owner. This meant that free states had to directly cooperate in slavery. The South didn't fuck with the bill either because it meant that the freshly acquired territories of New Mexico and California were admitted as free states, therefore tipping the political balance in free state favor. And this Compromise of 1850 is essentially the only thing of note. Warren G. Harding. Unfortunately, halfway into his first term, William G. Harding died of a heart attack. Warren G. Harding was a perfectly fine guy except for the fact that halfway into his first term, he died of a heart attack. His time in office was somewhat forgettable, marking a return to normalcy after the First World War. He mainly focused on pro-business policies and cutting costs for the government. In doing so, he vetoed a bonus bill for veterans who had just been injured during the war, which is kind of slack. While he was never found to be directly involved, the Teapot Dome scandal also occurred during his time in office, in which federal oil reserves were secretly leased out to individuals for bribes. Warren G. Harding, though, was apparently incredibly charismatic and he had a booming voice. He also could have been the first person to sext because he got caught sending a bunch of spicy love letters to his mistress, including one which said, and I quote, "I love your poise of perfect thighs when they hold me in paradise." Little bit raunchy. Martin Van Buren inherited an economic downturn after Andrew Jackson got rid of the Central US Bank. But Martin himself did not handle it well. He opposed the annexation of Texas, and he was also a notable force in forming the Democratic Party and heavily influencing the modern two-party system. Another quiet guy, he was dubbed the Little Magician for the way he got things done behind the scenes. However, you'll find with these political nicknames, they are often a lot lamer than they sound. He avoided public speaking when possible and was probably just a shy old man. Another very short tenure, as he was assassinated 200 days into his presidency. However, in that short time frame, he strongly pushed for civil service reforms and education for Black Americans. Unlike most of the others on this list, Garfield began his life in poverty, a sort of rags to riches journey, as he used to be a janitor to pay off his college debt. He was also ambidextrous, so he could write with both hands, which is a neat party trick, I guess. Not to mention, when he was shot, the bullet itself did not kill him, but instead it was the surgeons prying around in there with their unwashed, filthy hands. This led to major medical reform and changed medical practice forever. Before Zachary Taylor's time as president, he had no past political experience. He was basically just elected for his 40 years as a general during the Mexican-American War. Following the Mexican-American War and the new territories, Zachary Taylor, despite being a southern state slaveholder, sided with the Union in favor of admitting California and New Mexico as free states. He urged Congress to bypass these states quickly, skipping the usual debate between slave states and free states. This outraged Southerners and saw it as a betrayal by one of their own. When Southern state leaders threatened to secede from the Union, Taylor warned that he would see it as treason and, quote, hang the first man he could lay his hands on who tried to pull down the flag. The crowd must have been going crazy after that one, that's cold. But he died 16 months into his presidency. The vice president during Obama's time in office got his time as the main man in 2021, during the time of which the country was still in the full pandemic crisis. Biden's administration focused on healing the country and a vaccine rollout plan. After the nation reopened, there was a surprising surge of job growth from 2021 to 2023. He also rejoined the Paris Climate Act after Trump left it in the previous term. Biden also passed the IRA, which put government funds into effort like clean energy subsidies, climate preservation, and lowering prescription drug costs. I have nothing against the man. I think he did a decent job as president, but in terms of aura, this guy kind of got fucked. During the 2020 election, the amount of personal attacks that came from Trump just absolutely assassinated this man's public image.
And more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
Now, Sleepy Joe would say the unemployment rate in the great state of Ohio. No, you're in South Carolina. Joe, you're in South. They come up with you. Ever see the guy that no, it's South Carolina. It's not Ohio. Okay.
And he was the oldest president to date. There were times when he was like actually falling asleep and shit.
Yes, wake up.
So that kind of hurts your aura. But yeah, seems like a good guy. You would love him to be your grandpa. He loves his 1967 Corvette, aviator sunglasses, and also he's a bit of a lover boy. He proposed to his wife 5 times before she finally said yes. Chester's presidency is most notorious for his signature on the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which created a merit-based system for civil service jobs, and to acquire a position you would also need to pass a civil service exam. This halted widespread corruption and made sure government jobs were given to those deserving of it. And from my brief research, he seems to be the president with the toughest fit. Apparently he would change 5 times a day and was referred to as the gentleman boss. Despite that, Drip does not excuse racism, as he also passed one of the first immigration acts that limited Chinese laborers from coming to the United States. George W. Bush's legacy is overshadowed by the tragedy of 9/11 and the war on terror thereafter. Bush reshaped foreign policy with an aggressive new doctrine that the US would use preemptive military force against any nation they saw emerging as a threat. On October 30th, Bush threw the first pitch of Game 3 of the World Series in a bulletproof vest. Obviously, 9/11 led to the war in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda, and then later on the Iraq War in 2003, justified by claims that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. These claims were never proven, and the war became long, costly, and deeply divisive. Bush also propelled the Department of Homeland Security and increased surveillance under the Patriot Act. But he also made major education reforms under the No Child Left Behind Act, which set a higher standard for public schools and ensured that all children were being given equal education, especially those who were disabled. As if 9/11 was not bad enough, at the end of Bush's term, he oversaw the 2008 financial crisis, the worst since the Great Depression. He approved emergency measures such as the TARP bank bailout program to stabilize the economy. The time of his presidency also coincided with the birth of the first meme memes, so he has a plethora of funny/infamous meme moments. His aura is definitely decent, so we're getting out of that bottom tier of scrubs. Herbert over here got the short end of the stick. As soon as he began his presidency, the stock market crashed and the US economy steeped into the Great Depression. Hoover himself believed in limited government intervention, which did not help at all. However, he was an acclaimed humanitarian and credited engineer before his time in presidency. The Hoover Dam is literally named after him because without him it wouldn't have been brought to reality. Going against his beliefs, he introduced the RFC, which gave money to banks and big companies, believing the money would sort of trickle down into the American citizen's pocket. While the RFC did aid in the crisis, it definitely did not stop it entirely. But Hoover was by no means a dull bulb. He was a self-made millionaire by the age of 40, and he led massive food relief programs in the war-torn areas of Europe after World War I. A presidential nepo baby, though, John Quincy Adams was somewhat of a genius. He was reading at 3, writing at 6, and attending Harvard at 16. If you couldn't tell by the name, he's the son of John Adams. He believed in significant government funding to things like roads and waterways. However, there are some questions about the legitimacy of his presidency because Andrew Jackson won both the popular vote and the electoral college vote, but he did not have the majority needed to become the president. Due to this, many believe that Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House at the time, used his power to sway the vote. John Quincy Adams later chose Henry Clay as Secretary of State. After Adams' presidency, he became a strong advocate against slavery. He was described as being cold and unemotional, which did not help him when making political allies, and contributed to his struggle to advance his policies. It is said he didn't care about popularity and just wanted to do what is right. And I can respect that, so not bad at all. Jimmy Carter was the 39th president. He's known for his humanitarian approach and his activism throughout the years. He faced many of the same struggles as the president before him, Gerald Ford, with high levels of inflation and high levels of unemployment at the same time. However, he had one of the largest diplomatic successes in US history when he brokered a peace deal between Israel and Egypt, which ended decades of conflict. Carter also formed the Department of Energy and warned US citizens about the dangers of relying on fossil fuels way before it was cool to do so. His leadership was tested during the Iran hostage crisis, in which 52 Americans were held captive for 444 days. More than a year in a hostage situation would make you think, what was Carter doing this whole time? Carter resolved the crisis by applying major economic and diplomatic pressure on Iran. He did this through international coalitions and trade sanctions against Iran, pressure which Iran couldn't take anymore after their war with Iraq. This slow strategy was incredibly unpopular at the time, but it did do one thing right. It kept the hostages alive. After his presidency, Carter worked all around the world mediating conflicts, eventually establishing the Carter Center. This became one of the world's most respected organizations, which ensured fair elections, fought illness, and brokered peace treaties all around the world. In fact, when the Carter Center eradicated guinea worm disease, one of the world's longest standing parasites, Jimmy Carter won the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize. Another fun fact about him is that before his presidency, he was a certified nuclear engineer, even leading a team of US Navy technicians to fix a partially melted down reactor in 1952. Fuck. Oh. Okay, finished Jimmy Carter. Who's next? Woodrow Wilson. He served as the president during World War I, a war in which initially the US remained neutral, but later entered the war when a German submarine missile came a bit too close to US land. Because of this, Wilson enabled one of the quickest industrial and military mobilizations of all time. Millions of Americans joined the war effort, which turned the tide in the Allies' favor. In 1919, Wilson traveled to Versailles to sign the peace treaty. He believed reconciliation was necessary, whereas other countries wanted a lot more revenge for Germany's actions. He also helped in establishing the League of Nations. However, the US itself would not join because the Congress thought it would drag the country into unnecessary wars. Wilson is the only president to hold a PhD, and he's known for his world peace campaign and his efforts during World War I. He would have the legacy of a perfectly moral man if it weren't for the fact that he was profoundly racist, which was shown through his various segregation policies. A real shame, because he could have been great. Just sucks that all the presidents are racist. Well, not all of them. William McKinley played a pivotal role in the victory in the Spanish-American War through appointing credited generals and leaders. As a result, Spain ceded the territories of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, therefore proving the United States as a major world power and forcing other countries to respect their trade with China. However, McKinley wanted to focus on the domestic market. He introduced major tariffs to help promote the American industry, and he backed the gold standard, which directly tied the US dollar to a block or some sort of amount of gold, therefore fighting inflation and stabilizing the economy after the Panic of 1893. Famously, McKinley ran his first campaign from his front porch, having groups of visitors come in and he would speak to them at a time instead of doing the nationwide tours normal for a presidential campaign. Not even leaving his crib and winning 2 elections definitely gives him some points. But it was in that second term which he was assassinated by a man who viewed McKinley as a symbol of oppression. George H.W. Bush handled the collapse of the Soviet Union very quietly and very humbly. Due to the end of the Cold War, Bush had to handle the new geopolitical landscape in a way that didn't cause any new conflicts. Apart from this, his liberation of Kuwait was one of the swiftest and most efficient uses of American military force to date. But back home, Bush faced secession, and in an effort to fix this, he had to break one of his big campaign promises.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
And the man must have had a pretty crazy life. He was the youngest pilot allowed to fly during World War II, and in one case he was shot down and he had to be rescued from the Pacific. His love for the sky never faded away as he continued to skydive on major milestone birthdays, even on his 90th. But there was one incident in 1992 in which he lost significant aura because he vomited directly on the chest of the Japanese Prime Minister. That's a yikes. Vomiting in public is always embarrassing. But he was commonly found wearing funky socks. After being elected the mayor of Buffalo in 1881, Grover Cleveland quickly rose the political ranks. Most of Grover's acts as president were in his belief to help the economy. He backed the gold standard and was anti-tariff, believing they helped big companies and hurt the consumer. This guy was the biggest cheapskate of all time. He denied so many pensions and bonuses that he was nicknamed the veto president. During his second term, the Panic of 1893 would occur, and it was during that panic that an incident known as the Pullman strike would happen. Basically, a train car company ran a company town, and due to the effects of the ongoing economic panic, the cost of living within that company town rose. However, it was that same company who refused to raise the wages of the workers. This led to a strike in which the American Railroad Union refused to accept any train with a Pullman car on it, effectively causing a nationwide shutdown. Grover Cleveland chose to quell this protest through means of force, sending federal troops into the area of Chicago. This led to riots and dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries, which leaves a nasty mark on Cleveland's reputation. Another thing that does that is, like I said before, he vetoed so many bills and so many subsidies, including one that gave aid to drought-stricken farmers. If you want any type of money, he's not playing that shit. Now, even though he's in the midsection of the list, I would say James Monroe is pretty forgettable. Apart from the one major action that made him known and remembered today, the Monroe Doctrine, which basically warned that if any European countries came to the Americas and tried to interfere, that the US would use full military force on them.
Stop doing full force! Fuck!
Which secured US power in the West. James Monroe himself was friends with George Washington, studied under Thomas Jefferson, and served under James Madison. If they were the founding fathers, James Monroe should have been the founding son. Yet other than the Monroe Doctrine, he didn't really do anything too crazy. The country's first economic depression happened under his watch, and he didn't handle it well at all, which for the time that he was president basically stopped westward expansion. Bill Clinton's presidency was defined by strong economic growth, centrist policies, and a major political scandal. As a new Democrat, Clinton blended liberal and conservative ideas, pushing for market-friendly policies while also supporting social programs. Under his leadership, the US experienced one of the most prosperous economic periods in modern history. Low unemployment, low inflation, budget surpluses, and booming tech-driven growth. Clinton also worked hard outside of the country, improving relations in NATO and trying to broker peace deals within the Middle East and North Ireland. A really solid political run which came to a screeching halt during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, in which Bill Clinton had an affair with a 22-year-old White House intern. At the time, Bill denied the allegations whilst under oath.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
But when new evidence emerged, Clinton admitted to the relationship.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky that was not appropriate.
The problem was not just the affair itself, but the fact that Clinton had lied under oath, which led to accusations of perjury and obstruction of justice. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him on those charges, but the Senate acquitted him, making him the second president to be impeached by at least one of the levels of Congress. This scandal dominated the news, damaged Clinton's reputation, and had major political fallout. However, public approval ratings remained surprisingly high. Clearly, Clinton was quite the cheeky boy. Apparently, he used to sneak out of the White House for late-night McDonald's. Old age kind of caught up to him, and he had a condition that forced him to go vegan. Another very surprising fact I found out about him is that he won a Grammy for his spoken word album, Prokofiev, Peter and the Wolf. How interesting that is.
What you say, that you only meant well.
After the tragic death of JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One, standing next to Jackie Kennedy in her still blood-covered dress. His first presidential speech, titled "Let Us Continue," highlighted his grief, yet the need for the nation to move on. He used the country's sympathy to push forward many of JFK's policies. Johnson passed several bills which outlawed discrimination and segregation in housing, the workplace, and public areas. He had a background in teaching disadvantaged Mexican-American children, which gave him a compassionate side as a president and inspired his war on poverty. However, the most infamous thing he did was definitely catapulting America into the Vietnam War, because he felt that if Vietnam fell to communism, then so would the rest of Asia. Now, there is nothing about this war that I can say that hasn't already been said. This is a huge bloodstain on Lyndon B. Johnson's aura, as the Vietnam War is famous for its brutality and pointless loss of life. Despite billions in military spending and thousands of troops' lives lost, the war was unwinnable, yet raged on for 19 years. On a brighter note, Lyndon B. Johnson himself was apparently quite the character. He would go to the bathroom during meetings and leave the door open, and continue talking like nothing weird was happening. On multiple instances, reporters would be asked to follow him through the White House, including in the pool locker room, to which he would answer their questions while completely butt-ass naked. Now that is a major power move. He's asserting his dominance, obviously, and he must have had a massive dick, because you don't do that type of shit unless you're packing heat. He also owned an amphibicar, which was like a car that could also be a boat and float on water, and he would play a little prank pretending that his brakes failed, and then the car would just like float on top of the lake, which must have scared people out of their boats. Harry S. Truman assumed the position of president suddenly following FDR's death. Soon after, Truman had to make the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing the Japanese to surrender. Now, the decision is both praised for ending the war and criticized for the massive death toll. 2 years later, the United States and USSR emerge as global superpowers, and the Cold War begins. In the wake of World War II, many European nations were weakened and susceptible to communist movements. The Truman Doctrine promised to stop the spread of communism and lead the free world. In 1949, Truman played a major role in establishing NATO, the first peacetime military alliance in US history. And Truman proved that the US was stern about their policy on communism, immediately getting involved in the Korean War. Though the war ended in a stalemate, the US made their stance clear. They would not allow the spread of communism. With all that drama happening internationally, it's easy to overlook Truman's work domestically. He gave major expansions to FDR's New Deal and he titled these expansions the Fair Deal, which desegregated the military, increased the minimum wage, and increased access to healthcare around the nation. Truman was a no-nonsense man. A sign sat on his desk which read, "The buck stops here," becoming a symbol of Truman's trusted decision-making. I guess after all, he really was a true man. James K. Polk led the nation through the Mexican-American War, which gained western states such as New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and California. With the new territories gained, the North wanted them as free states and the South wanted them as slave states. James K. Polk refused to make a decision and left it for Zachary Taylor to pick up the pieces. But other than that, the man did everything he set out to do during his presidency. He was described as a workaholic, and he was a strong leader through the Mexican-American War, settling the Oregon boundary dispute peacefully. John Adams escaped the XYZ affair, a diplomatic scandal with France that led to calls for war. Adams avoided full-scale conflict. He also signed a lot of documents that gave the government power to imprison and deport non-citizens. He was very obsessed with peace, not wanting to get the young nation into any unnecessary conflicts, though at the time that stance wasn't very popular. In terms of aura, John Adams is a pretty chill guy and a bit of a lover boy. Him and his wife wrote over 1,000 letters to each other, and he seemed to have a bit of a soul tie as well with Thomas Jefferson, as they were both founding fathers, and then when George Washington retired, they both ran for president. John Adams won the election, and Thomas Jefferson served as vice president, receiving the second most votes. And he would kind of undermine John Adams during his presidency. However, on the 4th of July, 1826, both men died. Nothing about John Adams is crazy tough, but he is the second president of all time and led the young nation after George Washington, which are big boots to fill, and I think he did an okay job. James Madison was given the nickname the father of the Constitution, which is definitely a little bit cold. He was president during the War of 1812, during which British troops invaded Washington, D.C. So Madison was forced to literally run from the White House, carrying all the important documents he could, including the Constitution. That war ended in a peace treaty, which bolstered national pride and gave the American government some legitimacy. That's cool and all, but standing at 5'4" and being 100 pounds meant that James Madison was quite literally victim weight. I mean, you could toss that boy around like it's Kick the Buddy. He was a really smart guy, but he was described as shy and almost awkward in public. And aura is how other people perceive you, so I just can't put bro that high. But definitely a name that will be remembered throughout history. Ulysses S. Grant was appointed by Lincoln as the commanding general during the Civil War. He made many efforts to push the civil rights of Black Americans, including the 15th Amendment, which allowed Black citizens to vote. And his administration took major efforts to fight and nearly crush the Ku Klux Klan, including an instance in which he suspended habeas corpus and sent hundreds of federal troops into North Carolina to arrest white supremacists. Ulysses S. Grant was a stable and steady president, known for reconstructing the nation in the way Lincoln would have wanted. His administration got found being a tiny bit corrupt, but Grant himself was never found to be directly involved. This guy was kind of a badass, I'm not gonna lie. Like, he was a military leader. He looks like a guy that you don't really want to fuck with. Now we're definitely getting into those higher tiers. In my opinion, William Howard Taft was a great president. However, unfortunately, the main thing he's remembered for is being a fucking chud. At his peak, he was 155 kilograms. However, Taft is the only president to have also served as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. During McKinley's presidency, he gave Taft the position of the Governor of the Philippines, a newly acquired territory won in the Spanish-American War. In this role, Taft proved his skills as an administrator by patiently building a democratic infrastructure within the nation and always involving the Filipino people in his decision-making. The people loved him so much that when Roosevelt offered Taft a role in the Supreme Court, which had been his dream since he was young, they staged massive public rallies asking him to stay, and it worked. Taft declined the offer, only returning to the US in 1904 to be the Secretary of War. Roosevelt loved Taft's personality so much that at the end of his tenure, he publicly endorsed Taft as his preferred successor. But the man himself didn't actually desire the position and said that Roosevelt kind of peer pressured him into it. Taft was in love with the law, justice, and the preservation of peace, even being one of the first people to lay down the groundwork for what would eventually become the United Nations. He was a big boy who was known to fall asleep during opera and meetings, and he was a great president overall. And he looks like such a happy guy. How can you hate him? Come on. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the former World War II Supreme Allied Commander. He brought a strategist's mind and a soldier's discipline to the Oval Office. Throughout the Cold War, he maintained restraint, refusing to directly engage with the USSR, however, still not allowing communism to spread. Within months of taking office, Eisenhower negotiated an armistice to end the Korean War. And he signed the Eisenhower Doctrine, which promised to fight communism building up in any Middle Eastern country. Beyond his actions leading the free world, Eisenhower made major strides in developing US infrastructure, establishing the interstate highway system, which revolutionized American transport. Eisenhower was so beloved that in 1952, both parties wanted him to represent them in the election. Overall, he was an intelligent and kind man. He oversaw the post-war economic boom, and despite the Cold War, he gave the nation a feeling of peace and comfort. In his final address, he warned the country that unchecked military spending would threaten democracy, a statement that still echoes to this day. Donald Trump is easily the most controversial president of all time. It is important that you remember with these rankings, I am not going off like how much I like them, how much I like their policies. I'm going off pure aura. And every other president, their scandals and controversies have been a nasty mark on their reputation. However, with Trump, he basically is the scandal. He is the controversy. Yet time after time, when people have said that he's done for and his career is finished, the administration has pushed through, so much so to the fact that he is still the current president at the time of me filming this video. His confidence and confrontational personality made the 2016 election reality TV.
I didn't think I'd say this, but I'm going to say it. And I hate to say it. But if I win, I am going to instruct my Attorney General to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation, because there has never been so many lies, so much deception. There has never been anything like it.
As before the presidency, Trump was kind of a celebrity slash business mogul, getting his start in business through New York real estate and becoming a famous personality through his reality TV show, The Apprentice.
Yes. Michael, yes, sir. You're fired.
At the end of Trump's first term, COVID-19 hit. In a matter of months, the pandemic had swept across the globe, infecting millions and enforcing worldwide quarantines. However, before COVID hit, the unemployment rate in the United States was at a record low. This could be in part due to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the largest tax overhaul in decades. It lowered corporate tax rates, adjusted individual brackets, and aimed to boost economic growth. Donald Trump and his businesses have been in over 4,000 legal cases. The biggest and most personal of which was during the 2016 election, in which Trump gave adult film actress Stormy Daniels hush money so she wouldn't expose their affair and risk his campaign. The jury found him guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records, becoming the first ever president to be convicted of a felony. Not only that, but Trump is the only president to be impeached twice. The first time for pressuring Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky into investigating Joe Biden, and the second time being caused by the events of January 6, in which he held a rally just moments before his supporters stormed the White House, injuring 174 police officers in the process. Now, whether you love him or you hate him, you can't deny everything he does demands attention. Even in 2015, his campaign started with him descending the golden escalator in Trump Tower. His personality is in stark contrast to so many of the presidents we've seen before. He is brash, he is cocky, he can be rude.
What you say? Oh, that you only meant well.
After the Watergate scandal and Nixon's subsequent resignation, Gerald Ford stepped in, stating, "Our long national nightmare is now over." The media has labeled him as boring, but the man really didn't have a chance. His presidency focused on restoring faith in the White House and regaining trust of the American people. He pardoned Nixon, choosing to heal the nation over his popularity, immediately after which his approval ratings tanked. During his presidency, the nation did struggle with high levels of inflation, inflation and unemployment. He vetoed 66 bills in an effort to stop government overspending, yet there was really not much he could do. The most interesting parts of his life happened before he was the president, which is a crazy thing to say. He won 2 NCAA football championships as a linebacker/center for Michigan State. At the end of his college career, he had multiple offers from the NFL, but he chose to go a different path. During a brief stint in his youth, when Gerald Ford needed some money, he decided to pick up modeling, even appearing on the front cover of the Cosmopolitan. Due to a couple public incidences, there have been many jokes made about the fact that Gerald Ford is clumsy, especially the ones that came off SNL. However, Gerald Ford always took these jokes in good humor. Andrew Jackson was the president you called if you wanted to run a fade. He was an honored war hero. He fought in over 100 duels, including one in which he took a bullet to the chest only to return fire and kill his opponent, who originally disrespected his wife's reputation. Also the first president to survive an assassination attempt after the assassin's gun jammed at point-blank range. When that happened, Andrew Jackson's natural thought process was to then beat the man with his cane. After a battle with Native Americans, he adopted one of them as his child. But this is strange because he later signed the Indian Removal Act, which forced millions of Native Americans to move to these selected wildlife reserves. Andrew Jackson also dismembered the Central Bank of America, believing it was corrupt and favored the wealthy. Due to his lack of formal education and his violent history, many saw Jackson as a backward barbarian. However, meeting him in person, they would be surprised by his friendly and approachable, yet strong and assertive personality. Andrew Jackson completely oozed aura. He even had a parrot that was screaming swear words at his funeral. But unfortunately, he kinda owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson, we all know him. He was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase, which at the time doubled the size of the United States. He wrote the Declaration of Independence in 17 days, and he focused on cutting government spending by reducing the military, which meant lower taxes for the American citizen. Jefferson could read and write English, French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and he even tried learning Arabic. He was considered a prodigy on the violin, and he was a genuine genius of his time. It is crazy though that the President of the United States could live most of his life in debt, but you cannot deny this man's intellect. He was a strong advocate for freedom of thought, speech, and religion, which is ironic considering during his adult life he owned more than 600 slaves. After the assassination of William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt stepped into the office, being the youngest person to do so at the age of 42. He filed over 42 antitrust suits to control monopolies and limit the power of big companies. Roosevelt also won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for negotiating a treaty between Russia and Japan, ending a brutal conflict. He was the first president to introduce national parks and in total protected 230 million acres of land, including the likes of Yellowstone National Park, one of the greatest national treasures America has to offer. One time in 1912, shortly after his presidency, he was shot in an assassination attempt. With a bullet lodged in his rib, he went on to check his breath for blood and then give a 90-minute speech. He went on expeditions to the Amazon rainforest and Africa, and on one of these, he got malaria, lost 50 pounds, and nearly died. Despite his rough country outlook, the man was quite a bookworm, reading a book a day even during the time of his presidency. Before his presidency, in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, Teddy quit his job as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to form a volunteer cavalry unit called the Rough Riders. The unit was made up of mostly cowboys and Ivy League athletes. During the Battle of San Juan Hill, Roosevelt led this unit up Kettle Hill through heavy gunfire. Even at one point, his horse got caught in barbed wire and he continued running on foot. This man is an absolute unit. If I had to describe his aura in one word, it would be powerful. It seems like you just couldn't stop this guy. After his mother and wife died on the same day of Valentine's Day 1884, Roosevelt moved to the Dakota Badlands to reconnect with nature. During his stay, he became a cowboy and once held a thief at gunpoint for 40 hours while waiting for the sheriff to arrive. Teddy Roosevelt was just an absolute tank, and you would be able to feel his aura on the other side of the room. Ronald Reagan dramatically reshaped American politics. He championed Reaganomics, a mix of major tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced government spending, intended to revive the economy after the stagflation of the 1970s. Supporters credit this with sparking long-term economic growth, and critics Critics argue that it widened inequality and increased national debt. Reagan's time in office was during the peak of the Civil War. At first, Reagan painted the USSR as an evil empire, but later in his terms he had quite a diplomatic approach, even developing a friendship with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Together they signed the INF Treaty, the first major nuclear arms reduction agreement in history. Reagan was known for how charismatic he was, which was really highlighted through all of his speeches. He probably picked up this natural charm in his career as a major Hollywood actor before politics. He had many lead roles, including one in which he co-starred with a chimp. He was the oldest president inaugurated before Biden, but he still brought a youthful energy to office, essentially rebranding the nation after the Depression of the 70s. The man also had a great sense of humor. After an assassination attempt with a bullet hitting him just centimeters from his heart, he walked himself into the hospital and was cracking jokes, asking the surgeons if they were Republicans. During the time of his presidency, the man had a pretty good public image. Richard Nixon originally lost the election to JFK in 1960, but 6 years later, Nixon would have his turn in office. Nixon was bold and pragmatic. He transformed the United States' role in the Cold War with the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which helped cool down the Cold War. And in 1973, he signed the Paris Peace Accords, which ended direct US military involvement. Nixon was also the first president to make a visit to China, which thawed decades of hostility between the two nations. Within the United States, he passed many acts to protect the environment, such as the EPA Act and the Clean Air Act. Famously, he also took the US dollar off the gold standard, a controversial decision that people still debate about to this day. And on top of all that, he established OSHA, which ensures workplace safety within the United States. However, despite doing all this, the thing Nixon is remembered most for is playing the piano. Of course, I'm joking, it's the Watergate scandal. Nixon's political genius led to paranoia. So much so that when 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee building at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., investigations revealed that the burglars were linked to Nixon's campaign team. And the White House tried to cover up its involvement through hush money, secret recordings, and obstruction of justice. As reporters and congressional committees dug deeper, it became clear that Nixon himself had approved of the cover-up. This led to the first and only resignation in US history.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Yet Nixon went out with style, holding up 2 V's for victory as he boarded the helicopter. In his short span as president, JFK was beloved by nearly every American. At 43 years old, he became the youngest elected president, and he modernized the presidential image. Before becoming president, Kennedy commanded over a Navy patrol boat. During World War II, the ship was sunk by a Japanese destroyer. Despite sustaining a major back injury, Kennedy swam to safety, towing an injured comrade for miles by a strap clenched between his teeth. It was for this act that he received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for Heroism. However, that back injury would never heal. Kennedy also faces Addison's disease, forcing him to take daily injections of painkillers, hormones, and stimulants just to get along. Yet he maintained a sleek and composed image. In 1962, Kennedy launched the space race, promising to have a man on the moon by 1970. Furthermore, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy stared down nuclear annihilation and stopped it by enforcing a naval blockade and negotiating a deal with Soviet leader Khrushchev to remove the nukes from Cuba. Even though his wife was a fashion icon, JFK still allegedly had multiple affairs, including one of which that was with Marilyn Monroe, probably the most popular woman on Earth at the time. Kennedy could have achieved many great things as president if only he was given more time. However, on the 22nd of November 1963, during a visit to Dallas, the world witnessed the most famous assassination of all time. And it was that assassination that sort of immortalized him. Kennedy remains one of the most charismatic yet mysterious figures throughout history. Now, do I really need to explain why George Washington is this high on the list? He fought in the French and Indian War, and obviously he led the revolution. The nation wouldn't exist today if it weren't for George Washington. He was unanimously voted in by the Electoral College, he ushered in the Bill of Rights, and established the federal court system. Apparently though, he had Klinefelter syndrome. That's kind of awkward, and unfortunately he also owned slaves. But in terms of aura, Washington knew what he was doing. He's an iconic symbol, the most elite American patriot of all time, as he literally began the country. Thomas Jefferson described him as the best horseman of the age, and others remarked that he rode as he did everything, with ease, elegance, and with power. Obama has got to be the smoothest president to date, and every single speech and public appearance, he would take the chance to be inspiring and hopeful. In fact, it was that hope campaign art itself that went viral, getting recreated in millions of different forms through filters, memes, all the sort. And his political actions speak for themselves. Obamacare was the largest reform to the American healthcare system since 1965. Even though Obama gained power during the 2008 financial crisis, in response he passed the 2009 stimulus package, which saved millions of jobs, bailed out the auto industry, and helped stabilize the banking system. By the end of his presidency, unemployment dropped from 10% to 4.7%. The man also played a major role in the Paris Climate Accord, the most significant climate control agreement in history. In every public appearance, you would see Obama touring, smiling, and actually being there with his fellow American citizens. Even his political opponents loved him, and under his power, America looked the most united it has been in a while. Not to mention, the man himself has insane ball knowledge on things like music, sports, and all types of culture. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in the first few months of his presidency, and he said even he himself was surprised. No matter which way you look at it, Obama did amazingly well in his 8 years as president. His farewell speech is a beautiful send-off riddled with ambition and pride for his nation.
Whose story is not yet written. Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you. May God continue to bless the United States of America.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
Come on now, it's Obama. How could I not have him this high? The best modern president of all time. Franklin D. Roosevelt served the longest presidency in US history. His term came in at roughly 12 years long, and he had the best inaugural speech of all time.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
First off, the man revived the economy after the Great Depression through a series of acts known as the New Deal, which provided millions of government jobs in expanding infrastructure. This New Deal literally constructed half of the modern country. FDR gained the American people's trust because he was naturally charismatic and intelligent. He had a knack for connecting with the average American, and this is especially evident in a series of radio addresses known as fireside chats, in which he would explain policy in plain language to millions of Americans. These speeches comforted the nation at its lowest and made FDR a symbol of hope. It's this symbol that he became, which is why I rank him so highly. And what's even more fascinating is that in 1921, 12 years before he ever served time in office, Franklin was diagnosed with polio, meaning he lost most of the function in his legs. However, he would still make an effort to stand strong in public appearances, even asking not to be photographed in his wheelchair by journalists. And as soon as he was starting to turn things around with the economy, the whole world plunged into the largest full-scale conflict of all time, World War II. After the full-scale involvement of Pearl Harbor, FDR quickly mobilized the nation. The war effort created millions of jobs, effectively ending the Great Depression. Unfortunately, Franklin died just weeks before Germany's surrender. His political prowess was so important. During the 12 years of his tenure, Americans said that they couldn't imagine another president running the country. And at my number one, I have Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln stepped up when the country was tearing itself to shreds. 11 states in total made up the Confederacy, and due to James Buchanan's activities as president before him, the South was given major time to create a powerful militia. Lincoln's main priority in his presidency was maintaining the Union, refusing to recognize the Confederacy as its own country. If it weren't for his success in doing so, the United States could have been permanently split into two countries. Even with no prior military experience, Lincoln would study maps and serve as an effective head of command. Originally, the war was about holding the Union together, but after his Emancipation Proclamation, the war became a fight for freedom. This proclamation demanded that all slaves in the South be freed and allowed black men to join the Union Army, in which over 180,000 would enlist, turning the tide of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was an amazing public speaker and one of the strongest abolitionists in history. On November 19, 1863, the president would travel to a blood-soaked battlefield in Gettysburg, delivering a 2-minute speech that would change the course of history forever. Even after the Civil War ended, Lincoln remained focused on freedom, pushing for the 13th Amendment to be added to the Constitution, which fully abolished slavery. However, unfortunately, he was assassinated before it was fully passed. He planned for national healing, stating that the country should move forward with malice for none and charity for all, orchestrating a gentle reconstruction of a country that just went through a civil war. I mean, how could he not be number one? The iconic top hat, he's indicted in the Wrestling Hall of Fame, and he ended slavery in America. With only 12 months of formal education, he became one of the country's top lawyers. He was a famous fan of Shakespeare and he loved cats as well. What can you hold against him? What can you hold against his presidential legacy? You can't, and he was 6'4". Come on now. Honorable mention, Benjamin Franklin should be in here, but he was never president, so unlucky. But yeah, I'm sorry that I ain't uploaded in ages. I need to get back on my grind. I have $0 in my bank account. But yeah, hoping to turn my life around. Please subscribe, it would help me a lot. And yeah, thank you.
All right, whatever. Whatever?
Wow.
Whatever? You don't understand.
You're right. You are right. I have no idea what's going on with you. So why don't you tell me?
Listen to me.
Okay, champ. You got it. Go for it.